This is the news in brief from the United Nations. UN Chief Antonio Guterres has spoken of his shock at the images of dead civilians in the Ukrainian town of Bucha, while the UN's rights chief on Monday spoke of possible war crimes. It follows the discovery of mass graves and hundreds of dead civilians lying in the streets of the Kyiv suburb in areas only just reclaimed from Russian troops after weeks of heavy fighting. In a short statement echoing widespread Western condemnation for the grisly development, the UN Secretary-General said on Sunday that it was essential that an independent investigation leads to effective accountability nearly 6 weeks since Russia invaded its neighbour. Also responding to the Bucha news, UN High Commissioner for Human Rights Michelle Bachelet said that she had been horrified by the images of civilians lying dead on the streets. Ms Bachelet said that reports emerging from Bucha and other areas raised serious and disturbing questions about possible war crimes, grave breaches of international humanitarian law and serious violations of international human rights law, adding that all measures should be taken to preserve evidence. Russia has denied that its troops were responsible for the killings. With the agreement of 195 states, a new flagship UN report on climate change out Monday has underscored how critical it is for the world to take urgent action to soften the impact of global temperature rise. The report by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, has had input from hundreds of scientists in dozens of countries. It assesses progress and gaps in limiting greenhouse gas emissions and reviews mitigation options across sectors including energy, buildings, transport, industry, agriculture and forestry. In line with previous reports from the Intergovernmental Panel, which was established in 1988, this latest edition sounded a strong warning that much bolder action is needed immediately to cut greenhouse gas emissions using sustainable methods. A lot of importance is attached to IPCC assessments because they provide governments with scientific information that they can use to develop climate policies. They are also a feature of international negotiations to tackle climate change. At least 90 people are believed to have drowned in a new Mediterranean shipwreck tragedy off the coast of Libya at the weekend. According to reports, a commercial tanker rescued 4 survivors from a life raft who said they'd been at sea for at least 4 days on an overcrowded boat. Reacting to the news, Filippo Grandi, head of the UN Refugee Agency, said on Sunday that Europe had proven its ability to host 4 million refugees from Ukraine generously and effectively, and that countries should urgently consider how to apply this to other refugees and migrants knocking in distress at its doors. Daniel Johnson, UN News. This is the news in brief from the United Nations. UN Chief Antonio Guterres on Tuesday added his voice to growing international calls for a war crimes investigation into the killing of civilians in the Ukrainian town of Bucha. The Secretary-General's comments came after shocking images from Bucha on the outskirts of Kyiv showed hundreds of dead people, some with bullet wounds and their hands tied behind their backs, and others burned or in mass graves in areas previously under the control of Russian troops. Mr Guterres told the UN Security Council that an independent probe was needed to guarantee effective accountability. In Geneva, the UN Rights Office, OHCHR, explained that the episode marked a new low in the war, with victims' bodies desecrated in death. OHCHR spokesperson Liz Throssell said that all the signs were that the victims were directly targeted and killed.
It's hard to see what was the military context of an individual lying in the street with a bullet to the head or having their bodies burned.
To Sri Lanka, where the UN Rights Office on Tuesday urged authorities to diffuse tensions peacefully after a state of emergency was declared in response to protests over the country's deep economic crisis. In the capital Colombo and beyond, people's concerns have been rising in recent months amid soaring costs for basic goods linked to a lack of foreign currency caused by COVID restrictions. The UN Human Rights Office, OHCHR, said that the situation had worsened and that there have been shortages of food and fuel, along with power cuts, prompting new protests by desperate Sri Lankans. Citing reports of excessive and unwarranted police violence against protesters, the UN Rights Office also said that social media networks had been shut down for 15 hours. Any use of emergency measures by the state must comply with international human rights law, said OHCHR. Its statement coming after UN Rights Chief Michelle Bachelet in February pointed to Sri Lanka's worrying drift towards militarisation. Desperately needed food aid has reached Ethiopia's Tigray region, where hundreds of thousands of people are close to famine. UN humanitarians have confirmed. The development comes after a ceasefire was agreed in late March between federal authorities in Addis Ababa and forces loyal to Tigrayan separatists. The truce, which follows nearly 17 months of brutal conflict in northern Ethiopia, mean that fuel tankers have been able to reach regional capital Mekele, the World Food Programme, or WFP, said. In a tweet at the weekend, WFP said that more than 47,000 litres of fuel were busy refuelling aid vehicles so that relief can reach the most vulnerable communities. The UN agency noted, however, that 200,000 litres of fuel are needed every week to meet humanitarian needs in the region. Daniel Johnson, UN News. This is the news in brief from the United Nations. In Ukraine, humanitarians said on Wednesday that hundreds of people have managed to reach safety after fleeing Mariupol, while there's also been condemnation for the killing of Lithuanian filmmaker Mantas Kvedaravičius, as he also tried to escape from the besieged city. In a statement, the International Committee of the Red Cross, ICRC, said that it had led a convoy of buses and cars carrying more than 500 people to Zaporizhzhia on Tuesday and Wednesday. All those transported in the humanitarian convoy had fled Mariupol on their own, said the Red Cross, which warned that thousands more civilians were trapped inside the devastated coastal city. They continue to need safe passage out and for aid to come in, the Red Cross insisted, noting that it was ready to provide relief once concrete agreements and security conditions allow it. UNESCO, the UN educational, scientific and cultural body, said that Mr. Kvedaravičius had died in his car while he was driving out of Mariupol at the weekend. He was 45. The filmmaker gained praise from critics for his documentary, Mariupolis, which screened at the Berlin International Film Festival in 2016. UNESCO Director General Audrey Azoulay denounced the killing and called for those responsible for his death to be identified and brought to trial in the interest of justice, freedom of expression and artistic freedom. The number of new COVID-19 infections has decreased for a second consecutive week, with a 16% decline worldwide in the last 7-day recording period, the UN Health Agency has said. The number of coronavirus deaths also decreased sharply by 43% compared to the previous week. Across the world, there were more than 9 million new cases and over 26,000 new deaths reported, and all regions have shown decreasing trends both in new cases and new deaths. WHO's COVID portal has registered more than 490 million coronavirus cases and over 6 million deaths. Health emergencies that are caused by climate change are on the rise in Africa, the World Health Organization, or WHO, said on Wednesday. Citing new data analysis, the UN agency said that the emergencies accounted for more than 1 in 2 public health events across the continent over the past 2 decades. Of more than 2,100 public health alerts in the African region between 2001 and 2021, 56% were climate-related. And there were 25% more climate-related events in the decade following 2011 than there were in the previous 10 years, WHO said. To address the growing dangers of human-induced climate change, the UN Health Agency urged governments to prioritise human well-being in all key decisions, end fossil fuel mining and subsidies, tax polluters, and implement WHO air quality guidelines. Daniel Johnson, UN News. This is the news in brief from the United Nations. The war in Ukraine has increased the risk of a massive malnutrition crisis for millions of children in other emergencies because of its already huge impact on global food prices, the UN said on Thursday. 6 weeks since Russia invaded its neighbour, the UN Children's Fund UNICEF said that imports have been disrupted to the Middle East and North Africa, where more than 90% of food has to be shipped in. Prices have also risen for essentials including wheat, cooking oil and fuel, and if the situation continues, it will severely impact children, especially in Egypt, Lebanon, Libya, Sudan, Syria and Yemen, UNICEF said. Adel Koder, who's UNICEF's regional director for the Middle East and North Africa, warned that families are unable to cope with unprecedented food price hikes caused by ongoing conflicts, political instability, the COVID-19 pandemic and the war in Ukraine. According to UNICEF, less than 4 in 10 young children in the Middle East and North Africa get the diets they need to grow and develop properly. Meanwhile, inside Ukraine, new satellite images have confirmed that the destruction of cities besieged by Russian forces is ongoing. According to high-definition photographs provided by the UNISAT service, damage to Mariupol increased by about 6% between the 26th of March and the 3rd of April. Much of this increase was in the coastal harbour and steel mill areas, UNISAT said in its latest update. Satellite footage from Bucha, where hundreds of Ukrainian civilians have been found killed following the withdrawal of Russian troops, shows that just over a quarter of the city has been badly damaged. To Eastern Democratic Republic of the Congo, or DRC now, where armed groups have continued to terrorise families, forcing thousands to flee for their lives. In an alert on Thursday, UN Children's Fund UNICEF said that conditions are dire and deteriorating at Ro refugee camp in Ituri province, where people are effectively trapped on a remote hill. The camp is home to more than 60,000 people and more than half are children. Many arrived last November after being driven from another camp in the town of Drodro that was attacked by men wielding machetes. This, UNICEF explained, was just one of the latest bouts of violence that have plagued eastern DRC for decades and displaced around 5 million people. In an appeal for help to end the insecurity, UNICEF Executive Director Catherine Russell warned that there have been many outbreaks of respiratory illness, diarrhoea and malaria already. Every effort should be made to strengthen service delivery for people sheltering at the Ro camp and to protect them from violence, she said. A wave of digitalisation across all parts of the economy has transformed traditional industry in the last 20 years, but it has also increased the risk of inequality, the UN said on Thursday. In a new report on global innovation, the World Intellectual Property Organization, or WIPO, said that digital innovation quadrupled from the year 2000 to 2020. And in the last 5 years, for which data is available from 2016 to 2020, digital innovation patents grew an impressive 172% faster than all other filings. The sector covers artificial intelligence, or AI, predictive technologies, highly sophisticated automation and big data, all creations that can spur economic growth when used alongside people and not instead of them. WIPO said that while these new digital innovations may help poorer countries to develop more quickly, others may miss out because they lack both the capital required to invest in the technology and the highly skilled workforce that is also required. Daniel Johnson, UN News. This is the news in brief from the United Nations. In eastern Ukraine, a reported Russian missile attack on a railway station that's killed dozens of civilians, including children, has been immediately condemned by the UN. In a statement on Friday, Amin Awad, who represents the UN Secretary-General in Ukraine, said that many suffered terrible injuries at Kramatorsk railway station and that the number of fatalities was likely to rise. It was widely reported over the last 2 days that the station and surrounding area had been full of civilians attempting to flee intensifying hostilities, Mr. Awad said in a statement, adding that he was extremely disturbed by reports that children, women, the elderly and people with disabilities were caught up in the attack. As conflict shifts to Ukraine's eastern oblasts, UN humanitarians appealed for local ceasefires so that civilians could escape the violence and to get life-saving aid in. 6 weeks since the Russian invasion, thousands of civilians are believed to be still trapped in the southern port city of Mariupol, where they faced weeks of heavy shelling. But there is still no truce agreement between Russian and Ukrainian forces to let them escape safely. Here's Jens Lacker from UN Aid Coordination Office, OCHA.
He said top priority of that is to get silencing of the guns in those cities, with Mariupol being the worst affected, those cities where civilians are trapped, to allow them to get to safety voluntarily to a place of their choosing, and to allow aid to get in. So this is an incremental process.
Since the Russian invasion began on the 24th of February, more than 4.3 million people have fled Ukraine, according to the UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR. More than 100 attacks on healthcare have also been verified, killing 73 and injuring 51. The war in Ukraine has also added to fears of skyrocketing global food prices, as the UN Food and Agriculture Organization FAO warned that its food price index had made a giant leap to its highest level ever since opening in 1990. FAO said that the export disruptions since the Russian invasion of Ukraine had led to a near 20% jump in cereal prices. To soften the impact on nations that import most of their food needs from both countries, 80 FAO members have appealed for the creation of a $25 billion fund to help them in the short term. Finally, to the Sahel and West Africa, where the number of hungry people has quadrupled in the last 3 years to reach 41 million. Issuing the alert, the UN World Food Programme, WFP, said that the figure rose even higher to 43 million if the Central African Republic was included in the food insecurity estimate. The problem is not limited to rural areas, as 16 million people live in urban spaces that are at risk of acute food insecurity. And WFP also warned that some 6 million children are undernourished in the Sahel. There are many reasons for the unprecedented food emergency in the Sahel and West Africa region, from conflict and displacement to climate shocks and inflation, made worse by the Ukraine crisis. According to WFP, prices have already increased between 30% and 50% in many places and even doubled in markets since the Russian invasion. Farmers are already deeply concerned about the next harvest after poor returns last year because of drought. WFP warned that they don't have enough food to cover their needs and that conflicts are escalating, and more than 6 million people have had to leave their homes in the Sahel. To provide life-saving help for the next 6 months, WFP urgently needs $777 million. Daniel Johnson, UN News.